The dust of Dry Creek settled on everything like a shroud. It clung to the weathered boards of the general store, coated the windows of the saloon until they were near opaque, and turned the main street into a river of red-brown powder that rose with every footfall, every wagon wheel, every gust of wind that swept down from the distant mesas. Eliza Callahan stood at the edge of this street, her market basket hanging from the crook of her arm, watching the dust devils dance between the buildings. She was a woman who had learned to move through the world without disturbing it, her presence as quiet as shadows at noon. Nearly 40 winters had carved their stories into the corners of her eyes, and the sun had painted her skin the color of old leather. But there remained something in her bearing that spoke of a strength earned through survival rather than granted by birth. The townspeople of Dry Creek knew her story the way they knew the hymns at Sunday service by heart. Without thought, through repetition, William Callahan had been a good man, they'd say, shaking their heads. Shame about the cave-in at the Copper Queen mine left his wife with nothing but that patch of land west of town and a lifetime of emptiness to fill. That had been 7 years ago. 7 harvests of watching the seasons change alone. 7 Christmases with no voice but her own to fill the silence of her small house. The children they'd never been blessed with became phantoms in her dreams, faces that shifted and changed but never quite formed, voices that called Mama in tones she'd never hear in waking. Mrs. Callahan. The grocer's voice pulled her from her reverie. Samuel Morrison stood in his doorway, flour dusting his apron like snow. "Got that salt pork you ordered? Fresh batch came in on yesterday's wagon." She nodded, adjusting her bonnet against the fierce afternoon sun. "Thank you, Mr. Morrison. I'll take 2 pounds." Inside the store, the air was thick with the mingled scents of pickle brine, coffee beans, and the earthy sweetness of potatoes. Other women moved between the shelves, their skirts rustling like whispers, their eyes sliding past Eliza with the practiced indifference reserved for those marked by tragedy. She had grown accustomed to being looked through rather than at, existing in the margins of their world like a footnote in someone else's story. "That'll be 40 cents, Morrison said, wrapping the salt pork in brown paper. His wife emerged from the back room, her arms full of fabric bolts, and her gaze lingered on Eliza with something between pity and relief pity for what Eliza had lost, relief that such loss had passed over her own threshold. Eliza counted out the coins with careful precision. Money was always tight, scraped together from selling eggs, taking in mending, and the occasional vegetables her small garden yielded. William's mining shares had died with him, buried as deep as his body in the mountain's belly. "You managing all right out there on your own, Mrs.?" Morrison asked, her voice carrying that particular tone women used when they felt obligated to show concern, but hoped for a brief answer. "Well enough," Eliza replied, tucking the wrapped pork into her basket alongside the cornmeal and dried beans she'd already purchased. "The roof's holding, and the well's still good. A woman alone." "Mrs." Morrison began, then trailed off, shaking her head. The unfinished sentence hung in the air like smoke. A woman alone was an aberration, a puzzle piece that didn't fit the picture of proper society. Widows were meant to remarry quickly or fade away gracefully, not persist in stubborn solitude year after year. Outside again, Eliza paused to let a team of oxen lumber past, their driver cursing the beasts in a steady, almost musical stream. The saloon across the street was already filling with men seeking refuge from the day's heat in whiskey and shadows. Their laughter spilled out into the street, foreign as a language she'd forgotten how to speak. The walk back to her homestead took her past the cemetery, its wooden crosses and stone markers jutting from the earth like broken teeth. She didn't stop, hadn't stopped there in 3 years, but her pace slowed as she passed the iron gate. William lay in the northeast corner, his grave marked by a simple stone she'd paid for with the last of their savings. "Beloved husband," it read, though beloved seemed too small a word for what he'd been. Her house sat a mile beyond the town's edge, a modest structure of wood and adobe that William had built with his own hands in the first flush of their marriage. The years had weathered it, worn down its edges, but it stood firm against the elements. The chicken coop needed new wire. She made a mental note to trade eggs for some at the hardware store, and the garden gate hung slightly askew on its hinges. Inside, the afternoon heat was trapped beneath the low ceiling, pressing down like a living thing. Eliza set her basket on the kitchen table and moved through the familiar ritual of storing her purchases. The salt pork went into the cool box, the cornmeal into a tin that had once held crackers, the beans into a glass jar on the shelf. The silence that filled the house was different from the quiet of the town. This was a deeper stillness, one that had weight and presence. It pooled in corners, draped itself over furniture, filled the spaces where voices should have been. She had learned to move within it, to let it wrap around her like a familiar blanket. But there were moments, sudden, unexpected, when it threatened to suffocate. She pumped water from the kitchen basin and splashed her face, washing away the dust of town. In the small mirror above the washstand, her reflection looked back with eyes that had forgotten how to hope. The woman in the glass was thinner than the bride William had brought to Dry Creek, her hair more silver than brown now, pulled back in a severe bun that emphasized the sharp angles of her face. Just another day, she told her reflection. The words a ritual as fixed as morning coffee. The afternoon stretched toward evening, and Eliza busied herself with the endless tasks that kept a homestead running. She fed the chickens, their cackling conversation the closest thing to company she'd have until tomorrow. She mended a tear in her everyday skirt, her fingers moving with the unconscious skill of years. She prepared a simple supper of beans and cornbread, setting a single place at the table that could seat 6, as darkness crept across the desert, painting the distant mountains purple and gold. Eliza sat in a rocking chair on the porch. This was her favorite time, when the harsh edges of the day softened and the world seemed to hold its breath. Coyotes called to each other in the darkness, their voices wild and free. Stars emerged one by one, like candles being lit in a vast cathedral. In the distance, she could see the faint glow of Dry Creek's lights, hear the occasional burst of noise from the saloon carried on the night wind. It was a world that continued without her, a dance to which she was no longer invited. Once, she had been part of that world, William's wife, a respectable woman with a place and a purpose. Now she was simply the widow Callahan, a figure of pity and discomfort, a reminder of how quickly fortune could turn. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders as the desert cold began to seep in. Tomorrow would bring more of the same, the trip to gather eggs, the struggle with the garden gate, the careful counting of coins to make them stretch just a little further. It was a life measured in small victories and smaller defeats, in the spaces between heartbeats where memory lived. Rising from her chair, Eliza paused at the threshold of her door, looking back at the vast emptiness of the night. Somewhere out there, life continued in all its messy glory. People loved and lost, laughed and wept, reached for each other across the darkness. But here, in this small circle of lamplight, there was only her and the silence she had learned to call home. "Love wasn't meant for me," she whispered to the stars. The words carried away on the wind like smoke. It was not self-pity that prompted the words, but a simple acknowledgement of fact, as true as the sunrise, as certain as the dust that would settle again tomorrow on the streets of Dry Creek. She stepped inside and closed the door, shutting out the night and all its possibilities. In the morning, she would rise and continue, because that was what one did. But tonight, in the privacy of her solitude, she allowed herself the small luxury of remembering what it had felt like to be held, to be seen, to be loved. The lamp flickered as she prepared for bed, casting dancing shadows on the walls. And in those shadows, for just a moment, she could almost see the shape of the life that might have been full of voices and laughter, of small hands reaching up to be held, of a love that endured beyond the grave. But shadows were all they were, And when she blew out the lamp, they vanished into the darkness that was her constant companion, as faithful as any lover, as enduring as the desert itself. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street as Eliza made her weekly journey to town. The routine had become as fixed as the stars: Tuesday for supplies, Friday for selling eggs, Sunday for church when she could bear the weight of sympathetic glances. Today was Tuesday, and her basket held 24 eggs nestled in straw, payment for the goods she needed. At the mercantile, she moved with practiced efficiency, gathering flour, coffee, and a precious tin of lard. Her fingers traced the price tags with careful calculation, each penny accounted for in the ledger of her mind. She was reaching for a spool of thread when a voice behind her made her freeze. Eliza Callahan. She turned slowly, her spine stiffening with recognition. Thomas Brennan stood there, hat in hand, his face broader than she remembered, prosperity written in the quality of his coat and the gold watch chain across his vest. Time stretched between them, elastic and strange, pulling her back to a moment she'd tried to bury deeper than her husband. "Hey, Mr. Brennan," she acknowledged, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "I heard about William," he said, shifting his weight from foot to foot like a schoolboy. "A terrible loss. He was a good man." The words were appropriate, expected, but Eliza heard what lay beneath them, the unspoken relief that it had been William in that mine, not him. She remembered another Tuesday, not long after the funeral, when Thomas had stood on her porch with flowers and promises. "A woman needs protection," he'd said. "William would want you cared for." She'd refused him gently then, still raw with grief, believing he understood. But understanding had turned to insult when she'd refused him a second time, and a third. The flowers stopped coming, replaced by whispers that followed her through town like tumbleweeds. "The widow Callahan thinks she's too good for an honest proposal. Pride goeth before a fall. She's not getting any younger." "How's Mrs. Brennan?" Eliza asked, her tone neutral as milk. Thomas's face colored slightly. "Well enough. We've been blessed with 3 boys. God's been generous," she said, turning back to the shelves. "Eliza," his hand touched her elbow, and she pulled away as if burned. "I want you to know what happened between us. I hope there's no hard feelings." She looked at him then, really looked, and saw not the man who had courted her in her widowhood, but a stranger wearing a familiar face. The Thomas Brennan who had called her cold and unnatural for choosing solitude over his bed was still there, beneath the veneer of prosperity and politeness. "There's nothing between us, Mr. Brennan," she said quietly. "Good day." She left without the thread, her carefully planned purchases forgotten in her haste to escape. Outside, she leaned against the hitching post, drawing deep breaths of the desert air. Her hands shook as she adjusted her bonnet, and she hated herself for the weakness. "You all right there, Mrs. Callahan?" She looked up to find Marshal Jim Hayes watching her with concern. He was one of the few in town who treated her with consistent kindness, perhaps because he too knew the weight of solitude. His wife had died in childbirth years before Eliza arrived in Dry Creek. "Just the heat," she managed. He nodded. "Not pressing. You need any help getting home?" "No, thank you. Marshal, I'll manage." She always managed. It was what she did. What she had become, a woman who managed, who endured, who continued despite everything. But as she walked home, Thomas Brennan's appearance had stirred up sediment she'd thought long settled. The memories came unbidden as she trudged along the familiar path, those first months after William's death, when grief had made her vulnerable and the future stretched before her like an endless desert. Thomas hadn't been the only one to come calling. There had been others: Jacob Muller with his 6 motherless children, needing a woman to cook and clean and warm his bed. Old Henry Vance, whose previous 2 wives had died worn out from childbearing, looking for a third to complete the pattern. Each proposal had been wrapped in concern for her welfare, but she'd seen the truth beneath they didn't want her. Eliza, with her memories and grief and stubborn spirit. They wanted a function, a role to be filled, a problem to be solved. The widow Callahan, alone on that homestead, disrupting the natural order of things. When she'd refused them all, the town's sympathy had curdled into something else. She became not a woman mourning her husband, but an oddity, suspect in her solitude. The whispers followed her like shadows. Unnatural, they said. What kind of woman chooses to live alone? Pride, others murmured. She thinks she's above taking another husband. But it wasn't pride that kept her alone in that house William built. It was the memory of what real love had felt like, not a business arrangement or a solution to loneliness, but a partnership of souls. William had seen her, truly seen her, in a way these other men never could. To accept less than that seemed a betrayal worse than death. Back at her homestead, Eliza threw herself into work with violent energy. She attacked the garden with her hoe, breaking up the hard-packed earth between the struggling tomato plants. Sweat soaked through her dress, and dust caked her skin. But she welcomed the physical exhaustion. It was easier than thinking, easier than remembering. As the sun reached its zenith, she paused to drink from the water barrel, and caught sight of her reflection in the still surface. The woman looking back was a stranger, wild-eyed, dirt-streaked, a far cry from the young bride who had arrived in Dry Creek full of dreams. She plunged her hands into the water, shattering the image. The afternoon brought no relief from the heat or her churning thoughts. She tried to focus on mending, but her fingers fumbled with the needle. She attempted to read from her Bible, but the words swam before her eyes. Finally, she gave up pretense of productivity and sat on the porch, watching the shadows lengthen across the desert. This was the danger of encounters like today's. They ripped open old wounds, made her question the life she'd built from the ruins of her loss. In the years since William's death, she'd constructed a fortress of routine and solitude, each day a brick in the wall between herself and the world that had hurt her. But one conversation with Thomas Brennan, and the walls felt paper-thin, as twilight painted the sky purple and orange. Eliza found herself at the trunk that sat at the foot of her bed. She hadn't opened it in over a year, but her hands moved with remembered purpose, lifting the lid to reveal the treasures within. William's Sunday shirt, still carrying the faint scent of his pipe tobacco, the daguerreotype from their wedding day, two young faces staring solemnly at eternity. Letters he'd written during their courtship, the ink fading but the words still clear. "My dearest Eliza," one began, "I count the days until I can call you wife." She pressed the letter to her chest, feeling the grief rise fresh as flash flood. This was why she'd refused them all: Thomas, Jacob, Henry, and the others. They had offered her security, protection, a place in society's order. But William had offered her himself, wholly and completely, asking nothing but that she do the same. Outside, night was falling over the desert. The stars emerged one by one, each a point of light in the vast darkness. Eliza carefully returned the treasures to their trunk and made her simple supper. As she ate her lonely meal, she thought about the woman she'd become, shaped by loss, defined by absence, marked by her refusal to accept substitutes for what she'd once had. The townspeople were right about one thing: it wasn't natural. This life she'd chosen, nature abhorred a vacuum, and she was living in one. A space carved out by death and kept empty by choice. But unnatural didn't mean wrong. Sometimes the most unnatural thing was the truest, like love that survived death, like loyalty that outlasted logic, like a woman who chose her own terms even when they brought her only solitude. Later, as she prepared for bed, Eliza stood at her window looking out at the star-filled sky. Somewhere out there, Thomas Brennan was settling into his comfortable life with his wife and 3 boys. The other men who'd courted her were living their own stories, having found more willing women to fill the roles they needed filled. And here she stood, alone, but not quite lonely, Empty, but not quite hollow. The encounter with Thomas had shaken her, yes, but as the desert cooled and the coyotes began their nightly chorus, she felt her equilibrium returning. She had chosen this life, with all its hardships and isolation, because the alternative, a loveless marriage, a betrayal of memory, was worse than any solitude. "Love wasn't meant for me," she whispered again to the darkness. But tonight the words carried a different weight. Not self-pity, but acceptance. Not defeat, but a strange kind of victory. She had loved truly once, and that love had marked her so deeply that she could accept no pale imitation. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to human grief and human choices, but Eliza found comfort in their distance. They asked nothing of her, expected nothing, judged nothing. They simply were, burning in their solitude across the vast night sky, each alone but part of a greater pattern she couldn't quite see. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new moments of doubt, new reminders of what she'd lost and what she'd chosen. But tonight, in the quiet of her hard-won solitude, Eliza Callahan was exactly where she needed to be, alone with her memories, her grief, and her stubborn, unnatural, magnificent refusal to accept anything less than the love she'd already known. The dust storm came out of nowhere, as they often did in late summer. One moment the sky was clear. The next, a wall of red-brown earth rose from the horizon like a biblical plague. Eliza had just finished hanging laundry when she saw it coming, a rolling mountain of dirt that swallowed the landscape whole. She raced to pull the sheets from the line, her fingers working frantically against the first gusts of wind. The chickens squawked in panic, feathers ruffling as they sought shelter. She managed to grab most of the washing before the storm hit in earnest, sending her stumbling toward the house with arms full of half-dry fabric. That's when she saw him, a lone rider fighting through the wind, his horse's head low against the assault of dust and debris. He was heading for her fence line, one hand on his hat, the other guiding his mount through the chaos. Even through the swirling dirt, she could see he was struggling. Without thinking, Eliza dropped the laundry and ran to the gate. The wind tried to tear it from her hands as she wrestled it open, waving the rider through. He didn't hesitate, guiding his horse into the relative shelter of her yard. Together, they fought to close the gate against the storm's fury. "Barn!" she shouted over the howling wind, pointing to the structure. He nodded, leading his horse quickly to shelter. Eliza gathered what laundry she could and stumbled after him, the world reduced to a few feet of swirling brown chaos. Inside the barn, the noise dropped to a dull roar. The rider was already tending to his horse, checking its eyes for grit, running practiced hands over its legs. Eliza caught her breath, shaking dust from her skirts, and got her first real look at the stranger. He was older than she'd first thought, perhaps 50 or more, with silver threading through dark hair and lines carved deep around his eyes. His face carried the permanent tan of a man who lived under open sky, and a scar ran from his left eyebrow to his cheekbone, an old wound, long healed. His clothes marked him as a working man, worn leather chaps, a faded blue shirt, boots that had seen countless miles. "Much obliged, ma'am," he said, his voice low and rough as creek gravel. "Storm caught me between towns." "You're welcome to wait it out," Eliza replied, maintaining a careful distance. Years of living alone had taught her caution. These summer storms usually blow through quick enough. He nodded, attention returning to his horse, a sturdy bay with intelligent eyes. His movements were economical, efficient, speaking of long years handling animals. When he was satisfied, the horse was unharmed. He stepped back, finally giving her his full attention. "Name's Caleb Mercer," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "I run cattle about 15 miles northwest of here." "Mrs. Callahan," she responded, the formal address a barrier she'd learned to maintain with strangers. Recognition flickered in his eyes, not the knowing look of someone who'd heard gossip, but simple acknowledgement, if he knew her story. He gave no sign. Instead, he glanced around the barn. taking in the worn but well-maintained tools, the neatly stacked hay. "Roof seems sound," he observed, "built to last." "My husband's work," she said, then wondered why she'd offered that information. Outside, something crashed. Probably the chicken coop door she'd been meaning to fix. They both looked toward the sound, and Caleb moved instinctively toward the barn door. "Best wait," Eliza said. "Nothing out there worth risking the storm for." But through a gap in the barn wall, she could see the coop door hanging by one hinge, banging violently in the wind. If it tore loose completely, her chickens would be exposed, vulnerable. She bit her lip, calculating risks. "That your coop?" Caleb asked, following her gaze. "It's been loose for weeks," she admitted. "Kept meaning to fix it." Without a word, he pulled a coil of rope from his saddlebags and fashioned a quick cover for his face from his bandana. Before she could protest, he was out the door, moving through the storm with surprising grace for such a large man. Eliza watched through the gap as he fought his way to the coop. The wind tried to knock him down, but he leaned into it, using his weight as anchor. He reached the door and somehow she couldn't see clearly through the dust managed to secure it with the rope, lashing it firmly to the coop's frame. He was back in the barn within minutes, covered in dirt but breathing steady. He shook himself like a dog, sending dust cascading to the floor. "Didn't have to do that," Eliza said, surprised by the tightness in her throat. He shrugged, pulling off the bandana. "Chickens need shelter same as horses." They stood in awkward silence, the storm howling around them. Eliza became acutely aware of the impropriety alone in a barn with a strange man. No chaperone, no witness but the wind. In town, such a situation would set tongues wagging for weeks. But there was something in Caleb's manner that eased her concern. He kept his distance, his attention split between his horse and the storm, making no attempt at familiarity. When he looked at her, his gaze was direct but respectful, seeing her without scrutinizing. "You traveling far?" she asked, more to fill the silence than from real curiosity. "Coming back from Tucson," he replied. "Had business at the stockyards. Long ride." "I'm used to it." Another silence, but this one felt less strained. The storm's intensity seemed to be lessening, the roar diminishing to a steady whistle. Dust still swirled outside, but the violent gusts were spacing out, losing their fury. "I should offer you water," Eliza said, remembering basic hospitality. "For you and your horse." "Horse would be grateful. I can manage." She showed him to the water barrel, watched as he filled a bucket for his mount. The horse drank deeply, and Caleb stroked its neck with absent affection. There was something in the gesture, the unconscious gentleness, that made her think of William, how he'd been with animals. "You raise cattle, you said?" He nodded. "Small operation, enough to keep busy." "Alone?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. Heat rose in her cheeks at the presumption, but Caleb didn't seem offended. "Mostly," he said simply. "Hire help at Roundup, but otherwise it's just me and the stock." She understood that the choice of animal company over human, the rhythm of work that filled the empty spaces, they were alike in that way. She realized, two people who'd learned to live with solitude as companion. The storm was definitely weakening now. Through the barn door, she could see patches of sky appearing through the dust. Soon he'd leave, ride back to his cattle ranch, and she'd likely never see him again. The thought shouldn't have bothered her, but something about the quiet way he'd fixed her coop door, the careful respect in his manner, made her wish the storm would last a little longer. "I best check the damage," she said, needing movement, action, something to break the strange spell of the moment. He followed her out into the settling dust. The yard was a mess, branches scattered, her wash blown to kingdom come, one shutter hanging loose on the house, but the coop door held firm, his rope work solid as any carpenter's repair. "I'm grateful," she said, meaning it. "That door's been troubling me for weeks." "Temporary fix," he warned. You'll need proper hinges soon enough. I know. She looked at the house, calculating damage, already planning the work ahead. Always something needs fixing. Nature of homesteading, he agreed. He glanced at the sun, now visible through the thinning dust. I should move on. Still got miles to cover. She nodded, not trusting her voice. He returned to the barn for his horse, and she found herself following, watching as he checked the saddle, tightened the girth. His movements were unhurried despite his stated need to leave. Leading his horse out, he paused at the gate she held open. Up close, she could see his eyes were gray as winter sky, steady and calm. He touched his hat brim again, a gesture of respect that seemed to hold more weight than the simple courtesy required. Thank you for the shelter, Mrs. Callahan. Thank you for the help, Mr. Mercer. He mounted in one smooth motion, settled himself in the saddle with the ease of long practice. His horse pranced a bit, eager to move after the forced stillness. He held it steady, looking down at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. That coupe door, he said. I pass this way regular, heading to and from town. If you need... He stopped, seemed to reconsider. I mean to say, I could bring proper hinges next time I'm through. The offer hung between them, weighted with possibilities. Eliza knew she should refuse, maintain the walls she'd built so carefully. A strange man offering help could lead to obligations, expectations, complications she'd sworn to avoid. But something in his manner, the way he made the offer without pressing, leaving room for refusal, made her nod. That would be neighborly of you, Mr. Mercer. He touched his hat once more and rode off, his figure gradually disappearing into the dust-hazed distance. Eliza stood at her gate watching until he was just a speck on the horizon, then nothing at all. The yard needed attention. The house needed cleaning. A dozen chores called for her hands. But she remained at the gate a moment longer, feeling something shift in her chest, not hope exactly, but a loosening of the tight grip she'd kept on her heart for so long. A man had come in a storm, fixed what was broken, and ridden away asking nothing in return. It was a small thing, perhaps meaningless, but as Eliza finally turned to face the storm's aftermath, she found herself thinking of gray eyes and gentle hands, of the way he'd said regular like a promise. In the barn, she discovered her laundry bundled neatly in a corner, protected from the worst of the dust. He must have gathered it while she wasn't looking. One more quiet kindness from a stranger who might not remain a stranger long. That night, as she sat at her window watching stars emerge from the clearing sky, Eliza didn't whisper her usual words to the darkness. Instead, she found herself wondering about a cattleman 15 miles northwest, whether he too sat alone watching the night sky, whether solitude felt as heavy on his shoulders as it did on hers. The storm had passed, leaving the air clean and sharp with the scent of wet earth. And somewhere in that vast darkness, a man named Caleb Mercer was riding home, carrying with him the memory of a widow who'd offered shelter and received help in return. A fair exchange that somehow felt like the beginning of something neither of them yet dared to name. 2 weeks passed before Eliza saw him again. She was wrestling with a fence post that had rotted through at the base, sweat stinging her eyes. When the sound of hoofbeats made her look up, Caleb Mercer rode toward her property, a canvas bag hanging from his saddle horn. He dismounted at the gate, and she noticed he moved with a slight stiffness on his left side, an old injury, perhaps made worse by long hours in the saddle. Without ceremony, he pulled a set of iron hinges from the bag. "Found these in Tucson last week," he said by way of greeting. "Thought of that coupe door." Eliza wiped her hands on her apron, acutely aware of her disheveled appearance. "Mr. Mercer, I didn't expect—" "Said I'd bring them." He glanced at the broken fence post. "Looks like you got bigger problems, though." "There's always something," she admitted, then caught herself. She wasn't one to complain to strangers or to anyone. He studied the post with a practiced eye. "Got a shovel?"
I can manage.
I'm sure you can. His tone was mild, matter of fact. But 2 pair of hands make quicker work. Before she could protest further, he'd tied his horse to a standing post and rolled up his sleeves. Together, they dug out the old post, and Eliza found herself falling into an easy rhythm with him. He didn't try to take over, didn't assume she couldn't handle the work. He simply worked alongside her, steady and sure. "There's a stack of posts behind the barn," she said when they cleared the hole.
My husband cut them before.
She stopped, unused to speaking of William to anyone. "Smart man," Caleb said simply. Always good to have materials on hand. They set the new post together, Caleb holding it steady while she packed dirt around the base. The sun beat down mercilessly, and she noticed the sweat darkening his shirt, the way he favored that left side when lifting. "You're hurt," she observed. He shrugged. "Old complaint. Horse and I had a disagreement years back. He won." When the post was secure, Eliza stepped back, surveying their work. "Thank you. Can I offer you water coffee?" He hesitated, and she could see him weighing propriety against thirst. Water would be welcome. She led him to the porch, where a pitcher sat in the shade. He drank deeply, and she found herself studying him over the rim of her own glass. In full daylight, she could see more clearly the map of years on his face, not just the scar, but the fine lines around his eyes, the weathering of endless seasons under the sun. "You mentioned Tucson," she said. "You go often." "Every few months. Better prices than local buyers." He set down his glass. "I should fix that coupe door before I go." They worked on it together, Eliza holding the door while he attached the new hinges. Their hands brushed once as they adjusted the alignment, and she pulled back as if burned. If he noticed, he gave no sign. When they finished, the door swung smooth and true. The chickens, who had been watching suspiciously from inside, ventured out to inspect the repairs. "That should hold," Caleb said, gathering his tools. "What do I owe you for the hinges and the work?" He shook his head. "Neighbors help neighbors. We're hardly neighbors. 15 miles is a far piece. In this country, that makes us practically family." The ghost of a smile crossed his face, gone before she could be sure she'd seen it. After he left, Eliza found herself thinking about that almost smile, the way it transformed his stern features. She went about her chores with an unusual restlessness, her mind returning to the easy way they'd worked together, the comfortable silence between them. He came again 3 weeks later, appearing at her gate with a haunch of venison. "Deer are thick this year," he explained. "Thought you might appreciate fresh meat." She knew she should refuse. Accepting such gifts could create obligations, but the prospect of something besides salt pork and chicken was too tempting. "I have preserves," she offered in exchange. "Peach and prickly pear." "That'd be fine," he said, and waited on the porch while she fetched the jars. This became their pattern through the cooling days of autumn. He would appear every few weeks, always with some practical reason, a tool to loan. News from town. Once a book he thought she might enjoy. She always had something to offer in return: preserves, eggs, once a shirt she'd mended after noticing a tear. Their conversations remained carefully bounded, but gradually expanded beyond immediate practicalities. She learned he'd come to Arizona after the war, seeking space and silence after too much noise and death. He discovered she could read and write better than most, had even taught school briefly before marrying William. "Why cattle?" she asked once, as they sat on the porch after he'd helped repair a shutter. The question felt dangerously personal, but he'd just told her about losing a calf to coyotes, and there had been real grief in his voice. "They're honest," he said after a long pause. "You treat them fair. They give you what they got. No pretense, no lies. Just life, plain and simple." She understood that. The appeal of straightforward relationships after human complexity had proved too painful. And the solitude. He looked at her then, really looked, and she saw recognition in his eyes. "Sometimes it's the only thing that makes sense." The visits became something she anticipated, though she'd never admit it aloud. She found herself saving small tasks for when he might come, planning responses to conversations they hadn't yet had. It was dangerous, this slow warming, but she couldn't seem to stop it. Town noticed. Of course. On her next supply run, Mrs. Morrison's eyes glittered with curiosity. "I hear Caleb Mercer's been calling."
He's helped with some repairs,
Eliza said evenly, selecting dried beans with careful attention. Mrs. Morrison's tone suggested volumes.
"Lonely man, they say. Lost his wife years back. Fever took her."
Eliza's hands stilled on the beans. She hadn't known, though perhaps she should have guessed. There was something in his manner that spoke of loss weathered rather than fresh grief avoided.
"Course, he's never shown interest in remarrying,"
Mrs. Morrison continued, watching Eliza's face.
"Keeps to himself out there, almost as stubborn as some others about staying alone."
The words were pointed, but Eliza refused to rise to the bait. She completed her purchases and left, but the knowledge traveled home with her like an extra weight in her basket. When Caleb next appeared bringing a rope to replace her fraying well line, she found herself studying him with new eyes, looking for signs of the grief he carried, the shape of his own losses. He must have sensed her scrutiny because he paused in his work, meeting her gaze with a question in his eyes.
"Mrs.
Morrison mentioned you'd been widowed," she said, surprising herself with the directness.
His hand stilled on the rope. 8 years come November. Magdalena. The fever took her and our boy both."
The simple statement hit her like a physical blow. A child, too. She hadn't considered that additional loss, the double weight he carried.
"I'm sorry,"
she said, knowing how inadequate the words were. He nodded, returning to his work.
"You understand."
It wasn't a question. She did understand the way grief settled into your bones, became part of your structure, the way you learned to move around it, carry it, live with it pressing always against your chest.
"People think it gets easier,"
she said softly. "It doesn't," he agreed.
"Just gets familiar."
They worked in silence after that, but it was a different silence than before. A shared understanding had passed between them, recognition of kindred damage. When he left that day, his farewell carried new weight, acknowledgement of the difficult ground they'd crossed. That night, Eliza lay awake thinking about Magdalena, wondering what kind of woman had captured Caleb Mercer's quiet devotion. Had she been gentle or fierce? Had she made him smile more than the ghost expressions Eliza occasionally glimpsed? And the boy, had he possessed his father's steady manner or his mother's spirit? These thoughts were dangerous. She knew. To wonder about his past was to invite him deeper into her present, to risk the careful balance she'd maintained. But as autumn wind rattled her windows and coyotes sang their lonesome songs, she found herself hoping he too lay awake, perhaps thinking of a woman who understood the weight of empty spaces. The next time he came, he brought winter firewood, his wagon loaded with split pine and juniper. She protested that it was too much, that she couldn't accept such a gift without proper payment. He just kept unloading, stacking the wood with methodical precision.
"Winter's coming hard this year," he said.
"You'll need it." "Then let me pay you." He straightened, looked at her directly.
"You do.
Every time you don't look at me with pity, every conversation that doesn't circle back to what I've lost, that's payment enough." The honesty of it stopped her protests. She understood exactly what he meant, the relief of being seen as yourself rather than your tragedy, the gift of normal interaction when everyone else treated you like broken glass. They unloaded the rest of the wood together, and when he left, she pressed a loaf of fresh bread into his hands despite his protests. "Neighbors help neighbors," she said, echoing his own words back to him. He almost smiled again, and this time she was sure of it.
"That they do, Mrs. Callahan."
As his wagon rolled away, Eliza stood among the stacked wood, breathing in the sharp scent of pine sap and possibility. Winter was coming. Yes, but for the first time in 7 years, the prospect didn't fill her with dread. She had wood for warmth, a door that didn't bang in the wind, and the promise of a wagon rolling back up her path when the world felt too large and empty to bear alone. It wasn't love, she wouldn't let herself name it that, but it was something, a connection, tentative as spring ice but warming with each shared task, each comfortable silence, each recognition of their twin griefs, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough for now. The cemetery sat on a rise overlooking Dry Creek, a collection of wooden crosses and stone markers surrounded by a fence that did little to keep out the tumbleweeds. Eliza rarely came here anymore. William's grave held his body. Not his memory, but something drew her this cool November afternoon. She carried wildflowers gathered from the creek bed, their purple blooms already wilting in her hand. The walk to William's stone was familiar, though grass had grown over the worn path she'd once traced weekly. She knelt, brushing dust from the carved letters, and arranged the flowers against the marker.
7 years,
she said softly.
Some days it feels like yesterday, others like a lifetime.
The wind carried no answer, just the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. She sat back on her heels, hands folded in her lap, and let the silence settle around her. This was why she'd stopped coming. The cemetery offered no comfort, no connection, just stone and earth and absence. A movement caught her eye. Across the cemetery, near the older section where the first settlers lay, a familiar figure stood motionless before a pair of graves. Caleb's hat was in his hands, his head bowed, shoulders set in a line of grief she recognized in her own mirror. She should leave, give him privacy for his mourning. But something held her in place, perhaps the way he stood so still, as if he'd become part of the landscape, or perhaps her own understanding of how heavy this particular silence could weigh. Long minutes passed before he stirred, settling his hat back on his head with slow deliberation. When he turned, he saw her and stopped. They regarded each other across the field of graves, two people caught in the act of remembering. He walked toward her, his boots crunching on dry grass. When he reached William's grave, he removed his hat again, a gesture of respect that made her throat tight. Mrs. Callahan. Mr. Mercer. He glanced at the flowers she'd placed. Husband. She nodded.
Your wife and son.
Yes. He looked back toward the graves he'd left. November 15th, 8 years today. The date struck her how he'd known it so precisely when she sometimes lost track of the anniversary of William's death until she was upon it. Different kinds of grieving, perhaps, or different kinds of losses.
Do you come often?
She asked. Few times a year, her birthday, the day. He paused. When the weight gets too much. She understood that too, the times when grief demanded acknowledgement, forced you to stop and pay tribute, lest it consume you entirely. I used to come every week, then every month. Now it's when you need to, not when you think you should.
Yes?
The simple understanding in his voice made her eyes burn.
Does it help coming here?
He considered the question, looking out over the scattered graves. Not really, but sometimes not helping is what's needed, to sit with it instead of always pushing through. They stood in comfortable silence, the kind that had grown between them over months of shared work and careful conversation. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and rose that softened the harsh landscape. I was thinking of heading back, Eliza said eventually. Would you, that is, if you're going toward town? I'd be glad for the company. They walked together through the cemetery gates, Caleb's horse following placidly behind. The road stretched before them, rutted and dusty, familiar as breathing. But walking it with another person changed its character, made it less of a burden and more of a path. Tell me about her, Eliza said suddenly, then caught herself. If you don't mind. You don't have to. Magdalena. The name came softly, like a prayer. She was small but fierce, came from a Spanish family down in Sonora.
Her father forbade the match, said I was too American, too Protestant, too everything. A faint smile crossed his face. She married me anyway. Eliza found herself smiling too. A rebel. In her quiet way. She had this strength. He paused, searching for words. Like water, soft enough to yield, strong enough to carve through stone. Made our life out there beautiful somehow, even when it was hard. And your son, Jamie. The smile faded. 4 years old, had her dark eyes and my stubborn streak. Just starting to help with chores. Proud as anything when I'd let him carry the egg basket. The image pierced her, a small boy. Dark-eyed and eager. Helping with the same chores she did alone each morning. I'm sorry. The fever came fast. I rode for the doctor, but by the time we got back, he shrugged, a gesture that carried years of what-ifs. They went within hours of each other. Small mercy. I suppose neither had to grieve the other. They walked in silence for a while, their steps falling into rhythm. The town was visible now, smoke rising from chimneys, the sound of life carrying on the evening air. William and I never had children, Eliza said, offering her own truth in exchange for his. We tried, wanted them, but month after month, year after year. She trailed off, then continued more firmly. When he died, I grieved that too. Not just losing him, but losing any chance of having his child. Something of him that would continue. The double loss, Caleb said quietly. What was and what might have been. Yes, she looked at him, struck by how precisely he'd named it. People don't understand that part. They see the empty house and think it's always been empty. But I had rooms planned, names chosen. We had 2 more chairs at our table, he said. Kept thinking we'd fill them. More children to carry on the place. Give Jamie brothers and sisters. After they died, I burned those chairs. Couldn't stand looking at them. The casual mention of destruction, of grief made physical, resonated deeply. I packed away the baby clothes I'd sewn. They're still in a trunk in the attic. Can't bring myself to give them away or look at them. They'd reached the edge of town, where the cemetery road met Main Street. By unspoken agreement, they paused, neither ready to enter the world of other people and their ordinary concerns. I should tell you, Caleb said, his voice careful. People are talking about my visits to your place. I know. It doesn't bother you? Eliza considered the question. 2 months ago, it would have. The whispers, the speculation, the assumptions about what a widow and widower might be doing, but something had shifted in her, gradual as seasons changing. They've been talking about me for 7 years, she said. At least now they have something new to say. That almost smile appeared again, a little stronger than before. Practical way to look at it. Mr. Mercer Caleb. His name felt foreign on her tongue, but right somehow. I value your friendship, your help, the way we can talk about them, without pretense or pity. If people want to make more of it than it is. Is that all it is? The question came quiet but direct. Friendship. She met his gray eyes, saw her own uncertainty reflected there. I don't know. I know I look forward to your visits. I know the house feels less empty after you've been there. I know that talking with you about William doesn't hurt the way it does with others. She paused, gathering courage. What is it for you? He looked away, toward the cemetery on its hill. First time in 8 years I don't dread waking up. First time the work feels like it's building toward something instead of just passing time. He turned back to her. I'm not looking to replace what I had, can't replace that, but maybe there's room for something else, she finished. Something different. Would you... He stopped, started again. Sunday dinner. Would you come to my place? I'm no cook, but I can manage basic fare. Thought you might like to see the ranch. The invitation hung between them, weighted with possibility.
to go to his home, to see where he lived his solitary life. To share a meal at his table, it was a step toward something neither of them could quite name yet. "Yes," she said simply. "I'd like that." They parted ways there, Eliza heading to the mercantile for supplies while Caleb continued toward the feed store. But she turned back once, watching him walk away, and caught him doing the same. They both smiled real smiles this time, not ghosts of what had been, and continued on their separate paths that somehow no longer felt quite so separate. That night, as Eliza prepared her simple supper, she found herself humming a low, almost tuneless sound she hadn't made in years. The house felt different, expectant somehow, as if it too sensed change coming. She thought about Magdalena, fierce and gentle, making beauty in a hard land, about small Jamie with his egg basket and proud smile, about Caleb standing at their graves, carrying his grief with the same steady strength he brought to everything else. And she thought about William, what he would say about this development. He'd been a practical man, not given to jealousy or sentiment. "Be happy, Liza," he'd probably say, whatever shape that takes. Outside, the November wind howled across the desert, but inside, warmed by the good wood Caleb had brought, Eliza felt a different season stirring. Not spring, she was too old, too scarred for that kind of fresh blooming. But perhaps autumn could be its own beginning, a different kind of flowering born from acceptance rather than hope. She would go to Sunday dinner. She would see his ranch, sit at his table, continue this careful dance they'd begun. And maybe, just maybe, they would find that grief shared could become something else, not love as they'd known it before, but connection, companionship, the warmth of another human who understood the weight of what had been lost and still chose to continue. The cemetery on its hill stood silent under the stars, holding its secrets and its sorrows. But in two homes, miles apart, lamps burned against the darkness, and two people who had thought themselves finished with such things dared to imagine otherwise. The storm built throughout the day, dark clouds massing over the mountains like an army gathering for assault. Eliza had lived through enough desert storms to read the signs, the pressure drop that made her old injuries ache, the nervous dancing of the horses in town, the way birds fell silent as if holding their breath. She'd spent the morning securing everything she could, tying down loose boards, herding the chickens into their reinforced coop, filling every available container with water. But by afternoon, she knew this would be no ordinary storm. The sky had turned an ominous green-black, and the wind carried the smell of rain and violence. The first drops came heavy and fast, followed immediately by a deluge that turned the world into a solid wall of water. Thunder cracked overhead like rifle shots, and lightning illuminated the landscape in stark, terrifying flashes. Within minutes, the dry creek bed that gave the town its name had become a raging torrent. Eliza watched from her window as her carefully tended garden disappeared under muddy water. Months of work, washing away in moments. But the garden was the least of her worries. She could hear Caleb's cattle lowing in distress from his ranch. The sound carried even over the storm's fury, and she knew what those cries meant. Flash floods could scatter a herd in minutes, drowning the weak, spreading the rest across miles of dangerous terrain. She should stay inside, safe and dry. It wasn't her ranch, wasn't her loss to bear, but her hands were already reaching for her oil slicker, her feet finding their way to her boots. She couldn't stand by while his livelihood washed away, not after all the help he'd given her. The journey to his ranch was treacherous. The road had become a river, and she had to lead her horse carefully along the higher ground, fighting wind that tried to tear her from the saddle. Rain lashed at her face, cold and stinging, and visibility dropped to mere feet. She navigated by instinct and memory, praying she wouldn't miss the turn to his property. When she finally spotted his fence line, her heart sank. The usually placid stream that bordered his pasture had become a raging monster, and she could see cattle struggling in the current, their eyes rolling white with terror. Caleb was there, of course,
chest deep in the flood, trying to guide a young heifer to safety.
Without hesitation, Eliza dismounted and plunged in to help. The water was shockingly cold, the current stronger than she'd expected. It knocked her off her feet immediately, and for a terrifying moment, she was underwater, tumbling in the muddy darkness. Then strong hands grabbed her, hauled her upright.
"What the hell are you doing here?"
Caleb shouted over the storm, his face a mask of rain and fury and fear. "Helping," she shouted back, finding her footing. "Where do we drive them?" For a moment, he looked like he might argue, might try to send her to safety. Then, lightning illuminated another group of cattle being swept downstream, and necessity won over protection. High ground past the barn eastern pasture. They worked together in the chaos, two small figures against nature's rage. Eliza had helped with cattle before every homesteader did, but never like this. The water sucked at her skirts, trying to drag her down. Her hands went numb with cold as she grabbed ropes, pulled on stubborn animals, fought to create order from disaster. Caleb was everywhere at once, his voice carrying over the storm as he directed her, called to the cattle, swore at the sky. Once, she saw him dive completely under to free a calf tangled in debris. Another time, he bodily lifted a yearling that had given up struggling, carrying it to safety with strength born of desperation. Time lost meaning in the storm. There was only the next animal to save, the next push through the current, the next moment of survival. Eliza's world narrowed to the few feet around her, to Caleb's voice calling directions, to the solid presence of his hand grabbing hers when the current threatened to sweep her away. At some point, she couldn't say when their hands stopped letting go between rescues. They moved together through the flood, connected by that lifeline of flesh and determination. When she stumbled, he held her up. When he struggled with a particularly stubborn steer, she was there to help drive it forward. The storm's fury seemed endless, but gradually they made progress. One by one, they pushed, pulled, and coaxed the cattle to the eastern pasture's high ground. The herd huddled there, miserable but alive, as rain continued to pour from the sky. Finally, impossibly, they got the last stragglers to safety. Eliza stood gasping in the downpour, her legs shaking with exhaustion. Clothes plastered to her body. Beside her, Caleb looked equally spent, his face drawn with fatigue and something else, a wild mixture of relief and disbelief. "You could have died," he said, his voice hoarse from shouting. "You shouldn't have. Why did you—" "You needed help," she said simply. He stared at her for a long moment, rain streaming down both their faces. Then he pulled her against him in a fierce embrace, his arms crushing her to his chest. She could feel him trembling from cold, from exhaustion, from emotion too large for words. "Thank you," he said into her sodden hair. "God Almighty, Eliza, thank you." Her name on his lips, the solid warmth of him even through wet clothes, the shared triumph of their survival, it all combined to break something open in her chest. She clung to him as tightly as he held her, no longer sure if the water on her face was rain or tears. They stood that way until the cold became unbearable, then stumbled together toward his house. The structure had weathered the storm better than the pastures. Sitting on high ground, William knew Caleb, she reminded herself, had chosen wisely. Inside, they stood dripping on his floor, suddenly awkward in the quiet after so much chaos. Caleb moved first, stoking the banked fire, pulling blankets from a chest. "You need dry clothes," he said, not meeting her eyes. There might be something." "Just the blankets," she said, understanding his discomfort. "If you could turn around." He faced the wall while she peeled off her sodden dress and undergarments, wrapping herself in the rough wool blankets. They smelled of cedar and smoke and him. When she was covered, she cleared her throat, and he turned back, having wrapped himself similarly. They sat by the fire, not speaking, watching steam rise from their wet clothes spread on chairs to dry. The storm still raged outside, But in here was warmth and quiet, and the strange intimacy of shared danger survived. "I counted 43 head in the eastern pasture," Eliza said eventually. "How many were there before?" 48. His voice was heavy. "Better than I feared. Without you," he shook his head, "I'd have lost half of them. Maybe more. Without you, I'd have drowned in the first 5 minutes. You shouldn't have come." But there was no anger in it now. Only wonder. "No one's ever—" He didn't finish, but she understood. No one had ever risked themselves for him like that. Not since Magdalena died, just as no one had held her, really held her, since William. "We're quite a pair," she said softly. "Two people who forgot how to need anyone, trying to save cattle in a flood." That drew a sound from him that might have been a laugh or a sob. "When I saw you go under, when I thought I'd lost you too," his voice broke entirely. She reached across the space between them, found his hand. It was warm now. No longer the desperate cold grip of the flood, but something gentler, more dangerous. "I'm here. We're both here." He turned his hand palm up, interlacing their fingers. They sat that way, watching the fire, listening to the storm's gradual retreat. Neither spoke of what this meant. This crossing of boundaries as violent as the flood itself. But something fundamental had shifted, as surely as the landscape outside had been reformed by water and wind. When the storm finally passed, leaving the world washed clean and strange, Eliza's clothes were dry enough to wear. She dressed behind a hung blanket while Caleb did the same on the other side. When they emerged, properly clothed and separate again, the wild intimacy of the flood seemed like a dream. But the evidence was there in the mud caking their boots, the exhaustion in their bones, the cattle safe on high ground, and in the way they stood a little too close, reluctant to restore normal distance. "I should see you home," Caleb said. "Check your place for damage." She nodded, though part of her wanted to stay in this transformed world a little longer. They saddled horses hers had found shelter in his barn. Clever beast, and rode out to survey the damage. The landscape had been radically altered. New channels cut through familiar ground, debris piled in unexpected places. But as they created a small rise, Eliza saw her homestead still standing, battered but intact. "Built to last," Caleb murmured, echoing her thoughts. At her gate, he dismounted to check the hinges still solid, his work holding firm. The small gesture of care, after everything they'd just survived, made her throat tight. "Caleb." He turned at his name, and she saw her own awareness reflected in his eyes. "What happened today?" "Changed things," he finished. "I know." They stood there, two people who'd built walls against the world, recognizing the flood had washed away more than earth and debris, the careful distance they'd maintained. The protective barriers of propriety and caution all swept away in the current. "I'm not sorry you came," he said quietly. "Scared as I was, angry as I was, I'm not sorry." "Neither am I." He remounted his horse, looked down at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Rest tomorrow. I'll come by day after. Help with cleanup." "We'll help each other," she corrected, and saw him almost smile again. After he left, Eliza stood in her muddy yard, looking at the evidence of the storm's passage. Everything would need repair, rebuilding, replanting, but for the first time in 7 years, the work ahead didn't feel like mere survival. She thought of Caleb's arms around her, the desperate strength of his grip when he'd pulled her from the water, of working together in perfect understanding, no words needed, of sitting by his fire, hands clasped, while the storm raged itself out. "Love wasn't meant for me," she whispered to the clearing sky. But the words felt different now, less like truth and more like an old habit ready to be discarded. Because what had happened today that wasn't the love she'd known with William, sweet and steady and safe. This was something else, forged in extremity, sealed by survival. And maybe,
Just maybe. That was exactly what was meant for her after all. The whispers started before Eliza even reached the mercantile. She could feel the eyes following her progress down Main Street, see curtains twitch as she passed windows. News of the flood rescue had spread through Dry Creek like wildfire, growing more dramatic with each telling. Inside Morrison's store, conversation stopped abruptly. Mrs. Morrison stood with two other women near the fabric display, their faces arranged in expressions of false concern that didn't quite hide their avid curiosity. "Why, Mrs. Callahan." "Mrs." Morrison said, her voice carrying that particular tone of scandalized delight. "We heard about your adventure during the storm." "The cattle needed saving," Eliza replied evenly, moving toward the counter. "Of course." Mrs. Templeton, the banker's wife, stepped forward. "Though it does seem rather unusual for a woman to be at Mr. Mercer's ranch during such weather, alone." The word hung in the air like an accusation. Eliza felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her voice steady. Would it have been more proper to let his livelihood wash away? "No one's questioning your intentions, dear." "Mrs." Morrison said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "It's just that people talk. A widow and a widower, spending so much time together. And now this." "This," Eliza turned to face them fully. "This was neighbors helping each other through disaster. Nothing more." "Mrs." Templeton sniffed. "Martha Henderson saw you riding back from his place the next morning. Your dress was, well, it was quite muddy." The implication was clear, ugly in its assumptions. Eliza felt anger rise, hot and sharp. For 7 years she'd endured their whispers, their pity, their judgment of her choices. But this reduction of courage and cooperation to something sordid was too much. "Yes, my dress was muddy," she said, her voice carrying now. "From standing waist-deep in floodwater, pulling cattle to safety. From nearly drowning trying to save another person's livelihood. If that offends your sensibilities more than the thought of a neighbor losing everything, then perhaps it's your priorities that need examining." Shocked silence greeted this outburst. Eliza rarely spoke more than necessary in town, never challenged the social order. But the storm had washed away more than debris. It had eroded her patience for their small-minded judgments. She turned to Mr. Morrison, who had appeared from the storeroom. "I need flour, coffee, and salt. On my account, please." He hurried to fill her order while the women behind her found their voices again, whispering furiously. Eliza ignored them, but her hands shook slightly as she signed the ledger. Outside, she nearly collided with Reverend Thompson. The elderly minister steadied her with gentle hands, his face kind beneath white whiskers. "Mrs. Callahan, I heard about your bravery during the flood." She waited for the but, the gentle censure wrapped in religious concern. Instead, he surprised her. "It's rare to see such selfless action. You risked your life for another's welfare. That's true Christian charity." "Thank you, Reverend." Her throat felt tight. "Don't let the gossips trouble you," he said, lowering his voice. "Some folks have so little in their lives they must fill it with others' business. You did right." His support should have comforted her, but as Eliza walked home, the weight of the town's judgment pressed heavier than before. She'd crossed a line, violated the unspoken rules that governed widows and their behavior. There would be consequences. They came sooner than expected. That afternoon, Thomas Brennan appeared at her gate, his face set in lines of false concern. "Eliza," he said, dispensing with formality. "I've come as a friend. Have you—" She didn't invite him onto the property. "People are talking about you and Mercer. It's unseemly." "Unseemly?" She tasted the word, found it bitter. "Was it unseemly when I refused your proposals, Thomas, or only now that I've found friendship elsewhere?" His face flushed. "That's different. I offered honorable marriage." "You offered ownership," she interrupted. "A position in your household, not partnership. Caleb offers respect and genuine friendship. Caleb, is it? His voice turned ugly. You think he's different. He's a man. Eliza, living alone all these years, and suddenly he's sniffing around you like... Stop! The word came out sharp as a slap. Don't you dare reduce his kindness to something base just because you can't understand it. You can't understand it? Thomas laughed, harsh and mocking. Oh, I understand perfectly. You've been playing the grieving widow for 7 years? Too good for any of us. But Mercer comes along, and suddenly you're riding through storms to his ranch, spending the night, saving cattle, saving his life's work. Is that what you call it? He stepped closer, and she smelled whiskey on his breath. The whole town knows what really happened. A woman doesn't ruin herself for cattle. Eliza. Then the whole town is wrong. But she heard the tremor in her voice. Knew he heard it too. Are they, when he comes around next, ask yourself what he really wants. Ask yourself why a man starts courting a woman after 7 years of solitude. Maybe he's finally lonely enough to settle for what's available. The words hit like physical blows. Eliza gripped the gate to keep from swaying. Get off my property! I'm trying to help you, Thomas said, but his smirk said otherwise. Before you ruin what little reputation you have left. After he left, Eliza stood frozen at her gate, his poisonous words echoing in her mind. Settle for what's available. Was that how Caleb saw her? Not as Eliza, but as a convenient solution to solitude. She tried to push the thoughts away as she did her evening chores, but they persisted like thorns under her skin. Every kindness Caleb had shown took on new shading through Thomas's ugly lens. The repairs, the visits, the careful friendship, had it all been calculated approach? No, she knew better. She'd seen the grief in his eyes at the cemetery, felt the genuine desperation when he'd pulled her from the flood. Whatever was growing between them, it wasn't calculation or convenience. But knowing and believing were different things, especially when the whole town seemed determined to make their friendship into something shameful. When Caleb arrived 2 days later, as promised, Eliza was ready. She'd practiced the words, built her walls back up stone by stone. She would thank him for his friendship, but make clear that it needed to end. Better to cut things clean before they both got hurt. But then she saw him walking up her path. Favoring his left side more than usual, the flood rescue had clearly aggravated his old injury. He carried a bag of nails for repairs, and his face lit up when he saw her in a way that made her rehearsed words crumble. Eliza, just her name, but warm with something that wasn't calculation or convenience. Caleb, she forced herself to continue. We need to talk. His expression shifted, growing careful. About the talk in town. You've heard... Hard not to. Bought feed yesterday, and you'd think I'd committed murder from the way folks acted. He set down the nails, faced her fully. If it's causing you trouble, I can stay away. Stay. The offer was so simply made, so clearly meant, that it broke her heart a little. Here was a man willing to give up their friendship to protect her reputation, and she was about to do exactly what the gossips wanted. Is that what you want? She asked, instead of accepting. No. The word came quick and firm. No, it's not what I want. But I won't be the cause of more hurt for you. You've had enough of that. And you haven't... He looked at her for a long moment. The talk doesn't bother me. Let them whisper. But if it hurts you... It does hurt, she admitted. Not because I care what they think, but because they take something good and make it ugly. They look at friendship and see only scandal. Look at courage and see impropriety. Is that all this is? He asked quietly. Friendship. The same question from the cemetery, but weighted now with all that had passed between them. The flood, the rescue, the moments of connection that transcended mere friendship. I don't know, she said honestly. I know I'm tired of being careful, tired of living my life according to their rules and expectations, but I'm also scared, he finished when she couldn't. Yes. He stepped closer, not touching, but near enough that she could see the storm's echo in his eyes. I'm scared too. Have been since the day I met you. Scared of feeling again, of wanting again, of having something to lose. Thomas came by, she said abruptly. Said things, ugly things, about why you're suddenly interested after all these years alone. Caleb's jaw tightened. Thomas Brennan's a fool who judges others by his own low standards. You know better than to listen to him. I do know better, but the words stick anyway. Make me wonder if I'm seeing what I want to see instead of what's real. What do you want to see? The question hung between them, demanding honesty she wasn't sure she could give. But this was Caleb, who'd shared his grief, who'd held her in the flood, who offered to disappear from her life to spare her pain. I want to see a future that isn't just endurance, she said slowly. I want to see possibility beyond mere survival. I want... She stopped, gathering courage. I want to see you walking up my path and feel joy instead of guilt. Want to work beside you without wondering what people think. Want to sit by your fire again, but not because of storms. Something shifted in his face, walls coming down like dawn breaking. Eliza. He reached out, slowly enough that she could pull away, and took her hand. I can't offer you what William gave you. Can't be him. Can't replace what you had. I'm not asking you to. I know. That's why. He squeezed her hand gently. That's why this might work. Because we both know what we've lost. Both know this is different. Not less than what we had before. Just different. The town won't understand. Then we'll face that together, if you're willing. Together. The word held such promise, such terror. Eliza thought of her empty house, her careful routines, her walls built so high and strong. Then she thought of working beside him in the flood, of shared grief becoming shared strength, of the possibility of warmth beyond mere survival. I'm willing, she said, and felt the last of her walls crumble. He smiled then, real and full, transforming his weathered face. Then let them talk. We've survived worse than gossip. They stood there in her yard, hands clasped, while the desert wind blew clean and fresh around them. Soon they'd have to face the town, weather the storm of judgment and speculation. But for now, there was just this two people choosing connection over isolation, courage over comfort. That evening, as Caleb helped repair storm damage to her fence, they worked in companionable silence punctuated by easy conversation. When he left at sunset, he paused at her gate. I'll come by tomorrow, he said, and the day after, and the day after that, if you'll have me. The town will have to get used to it. He touched his hat brim in that familiar gesture, but his eyes held promises that were entirely new. Good night, Eliza. After he'd gone, she stood in her doorway watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. Tomorrow would bring challenges, more whispers, more judgment, more pressure to conform to the town's narrow expectations, but it would also bring Caleb walking up her path, bringing his quiet strength and steady presence. Love wasn't meant for me, she whispered one last time to the night, but the words felt false now, a lie she'd told herself for protection. Because love came in many forms, and perhaps this unexpected second chance born of loneliness and floodwater and shared understanding was exactly what was meant for her after all. Spring came early that year, painting the desert in colors Eliza had forgotten existed. Purple lupines carpeted the hills, golden poppies nodded in the breeze, and the Palo Verde trees burst into yellow bloom like captured sunshine. It was as if the land itself was celebrating new beginnings. She stood on the rise behind Caleb's ranch, watching his cattle graze peacefully in the green pastures below. The herd had recovered from the flood, even grown with new calves that kicked up their heels in pure joy of being alive. Beside her, Caleb pointed out which ones had been born since that terrible night, their existence a testament to survival and renewal. That little red one there, he said. She's got her mother's stubborn streak. Took 3 hours to convince her the world was worth joining.
Eliza smiled, remembering her own part in that birthing, how they'd worked together through the long night to save both cow and calf. So many shared moments over the past months, each one weaving them closer together. The town had eventually grown tired of gossiping about them. Moving on to fresher scandals, there were still those who disapproved Mrs. Morrison maintained her cold distance, and Thomas Brennan crossed the street rather than encounter them, but others had surprised her with acceptance. Reverend Thompson had invited them both to Sunday dinner, treating their relationship as natural as sunrise. Marshall Hayes had tipped his hat with a knowing smile, murmuring something about folks finding happiness where they could. "Wool gathering?" Caleb asked, noticing her distant expression.
Remembering,
She corrected.
this time last year, I couldn't imagine standing here. Couldn't imagine.
What?
Feeling hope again. Not just contentment or acceptance, but actual hope for what comes next.
He moved closer, his arms settling around her shoulders with the easy familiarity they'd developed. "And what do you hope for?" She leaned into his solid warmth, considering more mornings like this, more shared work and quiet evenings, more life lived together instead of just alongside each other.
That all?
She heard the gentle teasing in his voice and smiled.
What more could there be?
He turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "Well, Mrs. Callahan, there could be a good deal more, if you were willing." Her heart began a familiar flutter, part anticipation, part old fear.
Caleb.
"I'm not William," he said quietly. "Never will be. And you're not Magdalena. But what we have, what we've built, it's real and good and worth protecting." He reached into his pocket, pulled out something that caught the morning light. "Worth making permanent, if you'll have me." The ring was simple, a gold band with a small turquoise stone, practical, beautiful, unmistakably Western. Like them, Eliza thought, like what they'd become together. "I'm not asking you to forget the past," he continued when she didn't speak. "I'm asking to share the future. Whatever years we have left, I want to spend them with you, building something new on the foundation of what we've survived." Eliza looked at him, this man who'd appeared in a dust storm and slowly, carefully, helped her rebuild more than just broken fences and loose doors, who'd shown her that love could come twice in a lifetime. Different, but no less true.
The town will say we're too old for such foolishness,
she said, but she was smiling through tears she hadn't expected. "Let them. We know better." He cupped her face gently. "What do you say? Eliza, will you marry this old cowboy and scandalize Dry Creek all over again?"
Yes,
she said simply, and felt the word echo through her like church bells. "Yes, I'll marry you." His kiss was gentle, reverent, tasting of coffee and promises. When they broke apart, he slipped the ring onto her finger, where it caught the light like captured sky. They were married a month later in the small church, with Reverend Thompson beaming as he pronounced them husband and wife. The attendance was smaller than either of their first weddings. Some folks still couldn't approve, but those who came did so with genuine joy. Marshall Hayes stood as Caleb's witness, while the doctor's wife, Sarah Coleman, stood with Eliza, having become an unexpected friend in recent months. "You give me hope," Sarah had whispered as she helped Eliza with her simple blue dress, not white, for they were past such symbols of untouched beginnings. "That life can surprise us, even when we think we know all its patterns." The ceremony was brief, the reception modest, but as Eliza Mercer now, a name that felt both foreign and right, danced with her new husband in the church hall. She felt rich beyond measure. They moved slowly, accommodating his bad leg and their mutual lack of practice, but there was grace in their careful steps. "No regrets," Caleb murmured as they swayed to the fiddle music. "None," she assured him. "You, only that it took so long to find you." Later, as they rode together toward his ranch, their ranch now, Eliza marveled at how different this journey felt from her first wedding night. Then, She'd been young and uncertain, following William into an unknown future with nothing but hope to guide her. Now she knew exactly what marriage could cost, what it could give, how it could end. And still she chose it. Chose him. Chose the possibility of shared tomorrows over safe solitude. The ranch house welcomed them with lamplight and warmth. Caleb had spent weeks preparing it, adding touches to make it theirs: new curtains she'd admired in town, a bookshelf for her small collection, a rocking chair to match his on the porch, not erasing Magdalena's presence but making room for Eliza's, just as she'd done with William's memory. That night, as they sat on the porch watching stars wheel overhead, Eliza thought about the woman she'd been, the bitter widow who'd whispered, "Love wasn't meant for me," to the darkness. How wrong she'd been. Love hadn't been denied her. It had simply been waiting for her to be ready, for the right moment and the right person to help her heart open again. "What are you thinking?" Caleb asked, his hand finding hers in the darkness. "About seasons," she said. "How we think winter will last forever, but spring always comes, different each year, but always coming." "Speaking of spring," he said, "I've been thinking about expanding the garden. Maybe trying those tomatoes you mentioned, the ones your grandmother grew." "And I thought we might get some milk cows," she added. "Fresh butter and cream would be nice." They talked on, making plans like any married couple, building dreams from practical details. The conversation meandered like a lazy river, comfortable with silence when words weren't needed. This, too, was love, not the burning passion of youth, but the steady warmth of two people who'd chosen each other with eyes wide open. As the night deepened and cold crept across the desert, they went inside together. The house that had sheltered Caleb's solitude now held something else, not replacement for what had been lost, but new growth from old roots. Love rebuilt from ashes, strong enough to weather whatever storms might come. Months later, standing again on that rise overlooking their land, Eliza watched the sun paint the desert gold and red. Caleb was down with the cattle, his figure familiar now as her own heartbeat. She could see him talking to the animals in that low, steady voice, probably telling them stories they'd heard a dozen times before. The wedding ring caught the light as she shaded her eyes, and she smiled at how natural it felt now. The town had accepted them, more or less, though there would always be those who found fault. But she'd learned that others' opinions mattered far less than the truth two people built between them. "It was only waiting for us," she said softly. Not to the sky or the wind, but to the love that had found them both in the fullness of time. Not the love of their youth, fresh and untested, but something deeper love that knew loss and chose joy anyway, that understood pain and offered comfort, that had walked through darkness and emerged into unexpected light. Caleb looked up then, saw her watching, and raised his hand in greeting. She waved back, then started down the hill toward him, toward their life, their work, their chosen future. The desert stretched endless around them, harsh and beautiful by turns, demanding everything and giving back in equal measure. It was enough, more than enough. It was home. Thank you for listening to this story of love found again in the American West. If you're enjoying these tales of frontier romance and resilience, I'd love to hear where you're listening from, whether it's during your commute, while working, or cozied up at home. Please subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories and connections make this journey through the Old West all the more meaningful.